Hey guys, what is going on? So I wanted to talk about genetics as it pertains to bodybuilding and kind of the perspective that I like to take when it comes to, the whole topic of genetics. So this has been discussed at length in some recent YouTube videos from some other YouTubers that I really like. And I just kind of want to give my take because I think changing your perspective on how you view genetics is really going to end up determining what kind of results you get. And then I want to talk about the role that I think genetics actually play. But more specifically, I want to talk about the way that you frame the entire genetics argument, because I think that's much more important than how important genetics actually are, in a vacuum. Okay, so, first thing I do want to mention is, yes, genetics are very important in a vacuum. The reality, though, is that there are many different things that determine our training results, diet, training, recovery, mindset, right? So these are things that I'll get into in a bit. But the way that I like to look at this is to compare yourself to yourself, because that's ultimately what bodybuilding really is. Anytime that you're trying to improve yourself, you're ultimately just trying to get better than the previous version of yourself. And if you compare your current training protocol, your current philosophies on training, your current diet, or your philosophies on diet, your recovery, everything like that, I would really hope that modern day version of you is significantly better than, you 2 years ago. So if you can compare your former self, which you had at the time, you had a very biased opinion on your current thoughts, but modern day version is totally willing to say, oh yeah, 2-year-old Cooper, 2 years ago, he was totally stupid. I'm way smarter than him now. If you can apply that same logic to be like, okay, in 2 years, you're going to think that same thing about your current self. So where can you be better? What have you done compared to your past self to improve your training, your nutrition, recovery, everything that is kind of going on in terms of your bodybuilding goals? What have you done in that time period, and why can't you make that same jump in the following 2 years? Or maybe it takes you 3 years this time to make that big of a gap. Why can't you take that and understand that you are tremendously biased towards your own current beliefs in yourself and, how much you know about bodybuilding, how much you know about training. And hey, if you acknowledge that you really don't know a lot, which is kind of the situation that I'm in, as I learn more, it's kind of like the Dunning-Kruger effect, right? As you progress in your knowledge in all these areas, you realize how much more you still don't know. And then you kind of lose some confidence in your own knowledge. But the reality is that you're actually getting smarter and better every single year. You just understand, hey, I have a lot more to learn. And that's kind of the situation that I'm in. And if I compare myself to where I was at 2 years ago, I was plateaued. I thought, I'm reaching my natural limit. The gains are going to be really slow. And my understanding of training and diet at the time, I thought they were really good. And now looking back, I feel like my understanding is relatively worse, but clearly I am much more knowledgeable when it comes to diet and training than I was back then. And so that's the reality of the situation. I'm comparing myself to my previous self, which I no longer attach myself to because I'm better in every way from that previous person. Okay, so if you can then apply that same logic to potentially anybody else, somebody who has taken more time and put more effort into their training, put more effort into understanding their nutrition and recovery, and you say, hey, that person is smarter than me, that person works harder than me, that person is more efficient, right? If we can compare, ourselves to our previous self, why can't we then compare ourselves to somebody else? Because we are obviously much more similar to our past selves than we would be to somebody else. And the reality is that you can always improve on every single area when it comes to your training, nutrition, recovery, everything, right? So if you're able to take that mindset and always train harder, always be more efficient, always get better, with your recovery, with your diet and everything like that. I know I'm stressing these same points of kind of these main pillars, but it's extremely important because you have to get really, really good at the basics. And if you're not constantly getting better, if you look at, yourself from 2 years ago and you're like, yeah, I know about the same. That doesn't mean that you are at the tip top of understanding everything. It means that you are not consistent in trying to challenge your beliefs and trying to get better. So that's actually a huge red flag. If you think that you're not much better than where you were at 2 years ago, that is the problem, okay? If you aren't significantly smarter in every way, then that's really where you need to work on things. But if you're like most of us and you're trying to constantly improve and you are improving, you should understand that you can make that same jump again, and you can apply those same principles of constantly getting better with your training and everything like that and get better over time. Okay. So ultimately, the only set of genetics that matter are going to be your own. So when you're comparing yourself to your previous version of yourself, that is what matters. So your ability to say, hey, this training principle that helps me grow X body part, this seemed to work for me when I compare it to myself, 2 years ago. I'm going to continue to use that exercise to build this muscle group. Whereas if you observe somebody else and you say, this person only does close grip bench press, but they have massive triceps, you can understand that, hey, that doesn't apply to you. So that doesn't mean that, just because they didn't have to work very hard for their triceps, that doesn't mean that they have better genetics than you. It's just one aspect of their genetics, and they were able to get muscle growth from that, exercise, and therefore they spammed that exercise, got big triceps, and they were efficient with their training. If you were spamming close grip bench and you weren't experimenting with other things and figuring out what works for you specifically with your current set of genetics, which again is the only thing that matters, well, that is a problem with your ability to comprehend what works for you and what doesn't. If you aren't able to experiment and try things out for yourself, that is a flaw. That is something you need to work on. So as you consistently work on these things, you're going to find that so much more is actually in your control as you gain more knowledge, as you work harder. And then the idea of genetics, previously I used to think 2 years ago that I was near my genetic limit. I thought my genetics were the thing that was holding me back. Now I feel like my genetics are actually better than they were 2 years ago. It's not because my genetics change. I've always had the same set of genetics. I've just learned to work within the parameters of my genetics to a greater degree. I've gotten smarter in every way. I've gotten more efficient. I think I work harder now than I did back then. But I can also look and say, hey, if I walk into the room, I know I'm not the hardest worker. So I know I can even go further and I can work harder within the parameters of my programming, or just the fact that I'm using a program now versus back then I wasn't. There's a million variables that contribute to your ability to see success within bodybuilding, and you have to constantly be improving upon those variables to get results. And again, there's no way that you can actually change your genetics, and in fact you can't even quantify how good your genetics really are. So you can't know if you have amazing genetics until you've reached a level where you're like, oh wow, I'm objectively way more jacked than everybody else, I must have good genetics. You wouldn't know that until you actually got there. So just because you're progressing in a certain area slower than somebody else and you're doing the same set of exercises, they could be doing every other variable way better. They could be maxing out their sleep, getting a ton of food in, and you could just be sitting there. Sure, you're working hard in the gym, but you're not using exercises that are effective for you. You're not eating enough. You're not sleeping enough. So just because somebody's progressing faster than you doesn't mean that they have better genetics. And you might find that you get way, way further than them once you find what works for you. Okay, so I know myself, as an example, when I was in high school, the training program that I was using worked very, very well for me, to the point that I thought I had, really good genetics. I was responding very well. But then when I tried to do other things, I didn't respond to them very well. And then I started to lose faith in my own genetics because I wasn't using, in terms of the training program that I was using, or, lack of program at all, the way that I was eating, the way that I was sleeping, it clearly wasn't as effective as what I was doing before. So I've learned to try things and figure out what works for me, and, work within a program, in a diet that works for me. And hey, now I'm seeing results again because I'm finding that method that actually works for me. So you need to work on that and figure out what works for you. Another thing that just frustrates me to no end is when people talk about their genetics and they think that they had bad genetics because they show a picture of themselves when they were like 110 pounds and they were really skinny. All that tells me is that you ate enough food to be 110 pounds and no more. If you were really fat, if you were working out and you were bulking consistently and you just weren't building muscle, okay, that's a different story. But showing me an untrained picture of yourself when you were skinny and you weren't even working out, or maybe, hey, if you were working out and you were still skinny, you weren't eating enough to support that growth. So somebody being skinny does not at all mean that they have bad genetics. And in fact, we see a lot of people with elite genetics who start off really skinny, and it's just because they weren't eating enough food to be bigger, right? So it's the same thing. If you are trying to bulk up and gain muscle and you refuse to budge from 150 pounds, how are you going to get bigger if you refuse to eat enough food to get bigger? How is that going to happen? Like, you're going to stay 150 pounds if you eat enough food to support a 150 pound person. Okay. So these are just very basic things that I think people, they get so biased within their own genetics, within their own reaction to something. And as soon as they see somebody who looks really good, who responded really fast, the only thing that they can say is, oh, this person has really good genetics, when the reality is that maybe they just found a coach. Maybe they just found a training program. Maybe they actually started eating on day one. Maybe their recovery was really good. You don't know all the variables that come into play when it comes to somebody getting faster results than you. Or, hey, if they started off big, well, they ate enough food to be that big. Okay, so a lot of the things in terms of how you start, how you progress, that is all things on you being a beginner when you probably don't know what you're doing. And sure, there may be a few people who do know what they're doing or do get introduced to an effective diet or training program that works for them in the beginning, but you can't possibly know what your genetics are going to get you to until you actually get to that destination. And until you actually give every single area a ton of focus with your diet, training, nutrition, everything, or recovery, I mean, not nutrition. If you give all these things a significant amount of effort, that's the only way that you're even going to be able to have a guess on how good your genetics are. And spoiler alert, we don't have a way of measuring how good your genetics are. So you're not actually going to know. You're not going to have a definitive number of saying, oh, you're in the bottom 20% of genetics. You can't know that. So spending time thinking that your genetics are anything less than amazing, I think is a waste of time. And if you take your mindset and you think, I have amazing genetics, the only reason I'm not getting results is because of my lack of effort in these main pillars, right? In my recovery, in my nutrition, in my training. If you think of it from that perspective, you're going to find a way to improve upon those main pillars of muscle growth, and you're not going to blame it on your genetics. On the flip side, if you assume that you have bad genetics, you're like, well, regardless of what I do, it's not going to matter because I have bad genetics. You can see how that mindset, and I'm not saying that people have to think that they have amazing genetics or terrible genetics, but it's a spectrum and everybody lies upon that spectrum, but you don't know where you are. So if you assume the mindset of thinking that you have good genetics and you assume that the only variables contributing to your lack of success is your training and everything else that is associated with muscle growth outside of genetics, you're going to work on those things. And those things you actually have control over. You don't have control over your genetics. So I don't think it's a good way to spend your time thinking about that. And yes, you still have to acknowledge the importance of genetics, but we can't quantify that. And it's not a productive argument to have. All you can do is work with the genetics that you have, and try and dial in every other aspect of, training, nutrition, everything like that to really get the results that you want. So that's my opinion on that. Hopefully that kind of shifts your perspective, gives you more of an optimistic outlook on it. And hopefully you realize that you are more in control of your own fate than you realize. And as opposed to shifting the blame on things that you can't control, people that you can't control, focus on what you can control. And I promise you, you'll get better results than what you're currently getting. So anyway, that's all I got to say about that. I will keep you updated and I'll talk to you soon.